Previously, I wrote a book about the game Fallout and Fallout New Vegas. Along with them, I made a series of videos that were quite popular among my fan base. The goal of the book and the videos was to use the games to teach Marxist theory. If the theories were expressed in a manner in which people were accustomed to, it would make it much easier for them to learn. I think I did this quite successfully. After their success, I started looking at other games to write about. A few friends highly suggested the game Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl. I wasn't entirely convinced that it was a good game to write about. A friend on Steam sent me a copy while it was on sale, so I played it. Once I got about halfway through the game, I knew I had to do a work on it. I think the game is rich with ideas to be explored, even if it doesn't seem so on the surface. I really like the game Stalker. I absolutely love Fallout, but Stalker is a very close second. I'm a big fan of the open world concept that was pioneered by the Grand Theft Auto series, particularly GTA Vice City. The freedom to go anywhere at almost any time is going to become a staple platform in the future. It almost already has, but I think we're going to see it come to dominate. While Stalker is one of the earlier games to have an open world, I still think they did a pretty good job of it. I wish there could have been more places that you could explore. There's much more you could have done with the Chernobyl exclusion zone, given that it's about 30 kilometers, and expanding as the game says. I know it's not really that much, but I think some stuff could have been added. There were decent underground areas that could have been used. I'd like to see some dense forested areas that could serve as an obstacle in movement by blocking the player's view. I'd also like to see some special hidden areas with stuff in it, like in Fallout. But I understand that Shadow of Chernobyl was limited by the level of technology that when it came out, and the modifications that THQ made to it. A revolutionary advancement of the game was how non-player characters, or NPCs, continued to carry out activities even if the player wasn't in that particular area. The game was one of the first that allowed the game world to continue functioning despite the player's absence. Even if you wipe out a faction's post, they will respawn later. They don't just appear. Reinforcements march their way to the outpost. A few times I've come across a column of freedom soldiers on their way to reoccupy a position after I just cleared it of them. In a close line like that, a single grenade can do wonders. The NPC AI was also very enjoyable to witness. When going up against a group of enemies, they carry out military tactics. They don't just stand there shooting you, they take cover and fire from it. They also try to flank you by sending some of their forces to try and encircle you. I particularly liked the AI of the mutated animals. I was surprised to come across two predator animals fighting over the corpse of a fallen stalker. Watching the two animals fight over food added a very realistic feeling to the game. I think the developers did a really good job with this. One particular aspect of the game I enjoyed was the fact it wasn't made by an American or Japanese company. It was actually made by GSC Game. The fact that it was produced by a Ukrainian company which had native Russian speakers really added something. There was a very great Russian feel to the game, given the fact it takes place in a former Soviet state. I think this would not have worked if the game had been designed and programmed by Japanese or Americans. I think this is a case where you really have to have people who lived in the country and spoke the language in order to get an authentic Russian experience. Other games have tried to do this with other cultures and have failed miserably, creating laughable interpretations of Eastern European language and culture. SOCOM 2 immediately comes to mind. One particular aspect of the game I enjoyed was the fact it wasn't made by an American or Japanese company. It was actually made by GSC Game. The fact that it was produced by a One particular aspect of the game I enjoyed was the fact it wasn't made by an American or Japanese company. It was actually made by GSC Game. The fact that it was part of the appeal of the game and its design is the detail that went into creating an atmosphere. Everything has a dreary, hopeless feeling to it. I particularly enjoyed the very realistic thunderstorms that happen from time to time. Seeing the lightning strikes is enjoyable as they look realistic even though they're far off in the background. When running through the fields with your rifle held at the ready, I got a feeling that I was alone, but had the sense that there were threats beyond my immediate perception. This is just like walking through a forest at night. The background music is also very nice. It reminds me a bit of dark ambient music, which I also really like. I absolutely love Atrium Carceri from Cryo Chamber record label. Walking through the dark, dilapidated passages of old research facilities is greatly enhanced by the Stalker soundtrack, but my absolute favorite is the ambient noises when you stalk your way through the research facilities. The random creaks and bangs of the pipes and metal are dead on what you would expect from such a place. My favorite freak-out moment. The one that scared me the most was in the X-18 lab. When you first encounter the poltergeists, you can't see them. I was standing there checking a small room when two crates began floating in the air. I turned and looked at them, but I only saw them for a fraction of a second before they were thrown at me and smashed against the wall. I freaked right out when it happened. The game is based on the fiction novel Roadside Picnic by Arkady Boris-Stugartsky. The same novel inspired the movie Stalker by Andrei Tarkovsky in 1979. Interestingly, in the novel, people known as stalkers snuck into the visitation zones where the laws of physics were unstable to steal alien artifacts. These artifacts were also known as swag. Yes, the term swag was used in a 1971 Soviet novel to describe alien artifacts. The story is about a stalker named Redrick Red Schuhart, who is a veteran of sneaking into the zone to steal swag. Eventually, he finds a job with the International Institute for Extraterrestrial Cultures near a zone in Canada. Red enters the zone with a friend who is eventually killed. This tragedy causes him to spiral into alcoholism and depression. Red's girlfriend becomes pregnant and gives birth to a healthy baby despite the fact that expeditions into the zone cause birth defects. Unfortunately, the baby does not stay that way and begins to mutate into a monkey-like creature. Red returns to the zone to seek out the Golden Sphere, which is said to grant a person a wish. He is accompanied by a youth, which he knows must be offered up as a sacrifice before his wish can be made. Unfortunately for Red, he becomes attached to the kid, but sacrifices him anyway. Before he is sacrificed, the kid wishes for happiness for everybody, free, and nobody will go away unsatisfied. After he is killed, Red is overcome with guilt and repeats the youth's altruistic wish instead of wishing for his daughter. The book ends without letting the reader know how it turns out. It may bother some of my readers to hear this, but I've come to the conclusion that the game is anti-communist. Whether or not that is intentional, we can only speculate. I think the overall message of the game is that any attempts to be altruistic are inherently bad. In the story, the sea consciousness attempts to alter the noosphere with the goal of removing anger, cruelty, and greed, and other negative factors from the planet.
We are the result of an experiment aimed at creating a superconsciousness called sea consciousness. The consciousnesses of 7 volunteers were connected during the experiment, leading to the creation of the superconsciousness that is us. We immediately subordinated those who were conducting the experiment and assigned them to tasks we needed them to carry out. According to our calculations, Earth is surrounded by a special informational field, the so-called noosphere. It includes all the inhabitants of the planet with cognitive abilities. Our main goal was to make small adjustments to the noosphere, allowing us to remove things like anger, cruelty, greed, and other negative factors from the planet. Individuals are unable to affect the noosphere, but sea consciousness could. Unfortunately, we made a mistake, and our interference spawned the zone, which we had been trying to contain ever since.
Essentially, I see this as an analogy for the Marxist goal of reshaping human nature to eliminate hate, greed, and selfishness. In the bourgeois view, the Soviet Union was a total disaster that led to the ultimate evil totalitarian society that arises as the result of trying to make a better world and not just going with our so-called natural greedy nature. In the game, the sea consciousness attempts to make these changes, but makes a miscalculation. That miscalculation leads to a crack in the noosphere, for which the zone is a physical manifestation of. From there, reality is distorted by accident, causing unknown problems. Reality itself begins to break down, but there's no real explanation of exactly what that is. The zone becomes unstable and begins to expand. The goal of the sea consciousness is now to try and contain that expansion. I think this is clearly an analogy for the catastrophe that was the Soviet Union in the bourgeois view. This is totally in line with the capitalist philosophy of greed being good and the so-called virtue of selfishness. Only by acting in our economic rational self-interest can any good be created in the world. In order to be good, we have to be bad. Good is bad, bad is good, up is down, etc. I think this is quite Orwellian. The moral of the story seems to be that you can't change human nature. Any attempt to do so just leads to a disaster that's worse than the problem that is being fought against. I can't claim this is the intent of the game, nor can I claim that the developers and writers intended this message to be broadcast. I don't know what the creators of the game were intending. I can only give you my analysis. This is what I think the game says. Obviously, the game is much more complex than this. There are several themes throughout the game which represent the different aspects of society. Just the factions in the game alone represent different attitudes and outlooks towards the world. The Monolith faction, for example, works for the state consciousness, is a literal cult. This is a common, terribly ignorant view held by right-wingers that this is what communism is. The subject will be discussed at length later in this work. When researching the game, I ended up looking into the actual Chernobyl incident itself. I must confess that I didn't have any decent information on it beforehand. I'd heard about it, but I really didn't know anything about it. I watched a few documentaries and read a few research papers on it. What I read was astounding. What shocked me was how much worse the situation could have been. All of Europe could have been poisoned, killing millions of people. When the Soviets were trying to clean up after the incident, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Eventually, 500,000 people would be involved in the cleanup effort. This gave me pause to think about how close we really came to a major, major disaster. Researching this project was actually really informative and interesting. I hope this work lives up to the ones I've done in the past. Spent a lot of time writing and researching it. I hope it can be at least considered comparable to the Fallout book and videos I wrote. So I hope you enjoy it. Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl is a game by Ukrainian developer GSC Game. It features an alternate reality theme in which a second disaster occurs at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in 2006 and causes strange changes in the area around it. The game is a non-linear storyline and features gameplay elements such as trading and two-way communication with NPCs. The game also incorporates elements of role-playing games and business simulators. The background and some terminology of the game, like the Zone and Stalker, is borrowed from a popular science fiction novella, Roadside Picnic by Arkady and Boris Stugarsky, and the 1979 Andrei Tarkovsky film Stalker that was loosely based on it, as well as Stalker, the film's subsequent novelization, which later became the full version of Roadside Picnic. In Shadow of Chernobyl, the player assumes the identity of the amnesic Stalker, an illegal explorer/artifact scavenger in the Zone, referred to as Marked One. The Zone is a location of an alternate reality version of the Chernobyl power plant after a second fictitious explosion that contaminated the surrounding area with radiation and caused strange otherworldly changes in the local flora and fauna, as well as to the laws of physics. Stalker in its original film context roughly meant explorer or guide, as the Stalker's goal was to bring people into the Zone. The acronym Stalker stands for Scavenger, Trespasser, Adventurer, Loner, Killer, Explorer, Robber. On July 11th, 2007, GSC Game announced a prequel, Stalker, Clear Sky, which was released on the 5th of September 2008. On April 30th, 2009, GSC Game announced a sequel, Stalker, Call of Pripyat, which was released worldwide in February 2010. I think it's important to talk about the Soviet Union in regards to this game. The whole story surrounds the Chernobyl incident, which does take place in a particular context. It is, of course, impossible to talk about any kind of history which takes place in a socialist country without it becoming political. The very nature of the struggle between capitalism and socialism makes any kind of politically neutral discussion pretty much out of the question. The other reason I'm including some writing on the Soviet Union is because I've come to the conclusion that the game is anti-communist. This may upset some gamers, but I think there is a tremendous grounds for this view. Because the game, in my view at least, is anti-communist, I think it's important to counter some of that negativity with truth. I've written decent videos in the past talking about the history and the context in which it should be placed, so I believe that I will be able to do a fair enough job of it here. So allow me to enhance the analysis I'm going to give of the game with some backstory on the country that will allow us to see it in the correct political light. The Great October Socialist Revolution of 1917 marked the birth of the world's first experiment in socialism. led by the theoretical writings of Vladimir Lenin, which expanded upon the works of Marx. The struggle to build the first outright rejection of capitalism had begun. The Tsar's family had been eliminated along with many of his cronies. The nobles and aristocrats had their privilege and wealth torn down by a powerful wave of workers and peasants who rose up against the oppressive feudal order. All across the world, the ruling class shrieked in horror as the basis for their power was shaken to the ground in Russia. Mad denunciations of extremism were made, wailing at the idea of eliminating poverty and working together to build a more just world. At this moment, the world knew something had changed, something that could not be undone and would remain forever as a symbol of what people can achieve when they work against their oppressors and apply, properly, revolutionary theory. The bourgeoisie of the world now knew that it was possible to end their rule over the planet. From now on, they had to watch their backs for more than just mere strikes for higher wages. While the revolution was being led by the Bolsheviks, there were other groups in play. Bolshevik Red Guard forces under the Military Revolutionary Committee began the takeover of government buildings, eventually leading up to the capture of the Winter Palace, the central authority of the former capital, Petrograd. Afterward, there was a constituent assembly, with elections held on the 12th of November, 1917. In that election, the Bolsheviks had 175 seats in the legislative body, while the Socialist Revolutionary Party had 375. When the assembly finally met to discuss matters, they completely blocked the Soviet decrees on peace, land, and bread. The assembly was dismantled the next day on the order of the Congress of Soviets. What followed was civil war that lasted from 1917 to 1922, where the Soviets would eventually come out on top. The Soviet Union was eventually established, creating a unified republic of smaller sub-national Soviet republics. These republics were amalgamated on the 28th of December 1922. On February 1st of 1924, the British Empire officially recognized the Soviet Union. That same year, the Soviet Constitution was ratified. The state officially became a single-party government under the Communist Party. This is also a part of what is known as a vanguard party. The central leadership, operating under the philosophy of democratic centralism, would take up the task of organizing the country and planning the economic construction of it. The main purpose for this was to avoid the total economic disorganization of anarchism. Another was to prevent any reactionary forces from regrouping in the country to threaten the socialist revolution and transformation. Finally, a central state was needed to coordinate national defense against external military threats against the country, most famously that of the Nazi regime, which killed tens of millions. It should be noted that the Soviet Union was not without its economic difficulties. Since this was the first attempt at a socialist country, there were bound to be mistakes and lessons learned along the way. One of those mistakes was to jump ahead to communism too quickly. Russia was still very much a backward feudal country. Marx had explained very well that history proceeds through a process of evolution. One of those stages is capitalism, something the Russians did not yet experience. Essentially, the Soviets tried to skip over the capitalist phase and go right to socialism. The problem with this plan was that it failed to develop the necessary productive forces. Mao Zedong learned from this mistake of the Soviets here and developed his own solution to the phase of capitalism, new democracy. The Soviets, however, did not have the benefit of others' experience. They were forced to admit they had made a mistake in trying to do too much too fast. This led to the creation of the new economic policy. In attempting to go straight over to communism, we in the spring of 1921 sustained a more serious defeat on the economic front than any defeat inflicted upon us by Kolchak, Dankin, or Pilsudski. This defeat was much more serious, significant, and dangerous. It was expressed in the isolation of the higher administrators of our economic policy from the lower, and their failure to produce that development of the productive forces which the program of our party regards as vital and urgent. The surplus food appropriation system in the rural districts, this direct communist approach to the problem of urban development, hindered the growth of the productive forces and proved to be the main cause of the profound economic and political crisis that we experienced in the spring of 1921. That was why we had to take a step from which, from our point of view, our line of our policy cannot be called anything else than a very severe defeat and retreat. Moreover, it cannot be said that this retreat is, like many retreats of the Red Army, a completely orderly retreat to previously prepared positions. True, the positions for our present retreat were prepared beforehand. That can be proved by comparing the decisions adopted by our party in the spring of 1921 with the one adopted in April 1918. which I have mentioned. The positions were prepared beforehand, but the retreat of these positions took place, and is still taking place in many parts of the country, in disorder, and even in extreme disorder. The country was forced to face a limited experience of capitalism in order to build up the necessary productive forces to a point where socialism could be implemented. This was an unfortunate reality the Soviets were forced to face. Private property in some forms was allowed to flourish in order to build up the necessary economic base for development. There was a relatively free market for grain and other agricultural products, allowing the landlords to continue to have a certain amount of ability to exploit. As unpalpable as it was necessary in order to develop what was needed economically. It would not all go according to plan. With the death of Lenin, Stalin came to power and decided it was time to carry out a massive industrialization. This is when large-scale economic plans were drawn up to build a modern industrial economy. The plans were called the 5-year plans, very similar to what a corporation has. It should be noted that Cuba used a very similar system as well. It is only through industrialization that a country drags itself out of poverty. This is why it was so important to achieve. At this time, the Soviet leadership was well aware that there was a growing threat from Germany. Stalin wrote in his diary, along with many others, that they could see German imperialism on the rise again, and predicted a Second World War. It became a major concern that modern military technology be developed in order to combat the coming Nazi invasion. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it, or they will crush us. Unfortunately, the Soviet Union wasn't entirely prepared for the Second World War when it came. The Soviets signed a temporary non-aggression pact known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on the 23rd of August, 1939. Neither side had any intention of keeping their word. Hitler wanted some breathing space to gather forces to invade the Soviet Union. The Soviets wanted more time to develop the means to defend themselves. Despite not achieving that time frame, the Soviets still managed to hold out and win against the Nazis. At one point, they were able to outproduce all the other Allies combined in war production. With the war over, a massive drive was undertaken to rebuild the country after its near destruction at the hands of the Nazis. It would be a long and difficult road, but is one that would mostly be a success. After the death of Stalin, there was a power struggle that was eventually captured by Nikita Khrushchev. He was a war hero general in the war and the Nazis, so he had a pretty good reputation with the people. What preceded, however, was a total travesty. Khrushchev and several people close to him began the de-Stalinization of the Soviet Union. On February 25th, 1956, at the 20th Party Congress, he gave what is known as the secret speech, where he attacked Stalin and fabricated things to criticize him for. There were real things for which Stalin could be criticized and were, but Khrushchev went far enough to invent things to attack. In other words, the goal of reaching communism was about to be shoved aside for other goals. He would receive his comeuppance when he was forced out of office in October of 1964. It is here that Stalin showed in a whole series of cases his intolerance, his brutality, and his abuse of power. He often chose the path of oppression and physical annihilation, not only against actual enemies, but also against individuals who had not committed any crimes against the party or the Soviet government. Khrushchev believed that the Soviet Union could match the West in living standards. To accomplish this, they had begun producing mass amounts of consumer goods which were not necessary. They were luxuries intended to match the United States. Socialism, however, isn't supposed to be creating endless amounts of consumer goods. It's supposed to be moving people away from a consumer society towards an advanced social consciousness or anti-materialism. This created havoc on the state planning system, as it was not designed to take on that kind of superfluous production. Worst of all, this began the foreign policy of peaceful coexistence with the world capitalist powers. This is the ultimate reactionary policy that solidified the downfall of the Soviet Union. This is also the policy that led to the Soviet removal of nuclear weapons from Cuba. The Chernobyl disaster certainly had an impact on Soviet politics. During the reign of the reactionaries, the government had been very secretive, a trait left over from the Second World War. A lot of Soviet citizens were distrustful of the way that the government was operating, not just particularly with regards to the disaster, but in general. The Soviets were unprepared to deal with the disaster that took place. No one could have been ready for it. The disaster was unlike anything ever seen. The levels of radiation that were present had never been seen before. This difficulty took its toll on the public perception of the government. This incident was the catalyst for the revival of glasnost under Gorbachev. What he called for was transparency and openness in the operations of the government. This was particularly true with regards to administrative power. While this was seen as an openness, it was rather vague. Exactly what glasnost under Gorbachev was supposed to be was never really defined. What was seen was an opening up to ideas that were antagonistic towards socialism, much more than what was already being implemented since the death of Stalin. Perhaps the event was a wake-up call to the revisionists in power that some kind of openness would be beneficial, but then again, we really don't know what was going on behind closed doors. On Saturday, the 26th of April, 1986, around 1 a.m., the worst nuclear accident in history took place when reactor number 4 of the Vladimir Lenin Memorial Nuclear Plant in Chernobyl exploded. It was classified as a Level 7 event, which is the highest classification on the International Nuclear Event Scale. The only other incident to receive such a high rating was the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster in 2011. 31 people died in the initial explosion, while the effects of the radiation are still being investigated to this day. A number of 60 has been provided for trauma, acute radiation poisoning, and cases of thyroid cancer from an original group of about 4,000 cases of thyroid cancers in the affected area. The total death toll of people killed is still being calculated. So exactly what happened? At 1:23 a.m., Alexander Akimov did what he and thousands of other nuclear plant operators have been trained to do. When confronted with confusing reactor indicators, he initiated an emergency shutdown of Unit 4 of the large electricity generating station near Pripyat in Ukraine. Before pressing the AZ button used to initiate an emergency shutdown, Akimov and his fellow operators were immersed in the conduct of a special test. The procedure was designed to prove that the reactor could be provided with sufficient cooling water even if a complete loss of power to the large electric generating complex occurred while the emergency cooling system was inoperable. According to the engineering calculations, the inertia of the plant's big 500 megawatt electric turbines would allow them to generate enough electricity to keep cooling water pumps operating during the 30 to 50 second delay required to start the emergency generators. The engineers who designed the test were specialists in electric generators, not nuclear reactors. The historical record indicates that there was little consultation with nuclear reactor specialists during the procedure. The test was planned for a time when the plant was to be shut down for routine maintenance and its power output was not needed for the national electrical grid. Establishing the initial conditions for the test provided difficult and more time-consuming than initially planned. The first problem was that the grid needed the power longer than expected. It was after midnight when the plant was fully allowed to begin the test, and a new shift of operating personnel had just taken over. The new shift was not very familiar with the test and did not get a complete briefing by the off-going shift operators. The actions of the off-going shift operators had put the plant in an unusual situation because of the power history, and the resulting concentration of fission product poisons was different than any other situation considered during the design of the control system. The man in charge of the test, Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer of the plant, had been involved in the test preparations and in setting the initial conditions. The new operators deferred to him for decisions because of his experience, his official position, and his familiarity with the specific test protocol. The fire from the accident produced a great amount of smoke that went high into the air. Nuclear fuel, radioactive isotopes such as cesium-137, iodine-131, strontium-90, and other radionuclides were absorbed in the clouds and carried by the wind. This radioactivity did not take long to travel along the wind, falling into other countries, even as far away as England. In fact, the outside world discovered that their reactor had blown when Geiger counters in Swedish nuclear facilities detected the fallout. After the initial incident, it wasn't known exactly what the extent of the damage was. Even Gorbachev didn't have any solid information. He said in an interview years later that he at first was told that there was a collapse and a fire, nothing about an explosion. The radiation levels were already at lethal levels, but people had no idea what was going on right away. Life for the 43,000 people living there went on as though nothing had happened only 3 kilometers away. The population of Pripyat had only heard rumors that there had been a fire at the nuclear station. It would be several days before they knew what happened. Before that time, soldiers could be seen walking around the city with protective gear on. Their commanding officer, Colonel Vladimir Gribniuk, said that he had a metallic acidic taste in his mouth. The taste was that of the radioactive iodine in the air. In the story of Chernobyl, we saw a perfect example of a situation always getting worse, no matter how hard you try to fix the problem. After the extent of the damage had been discovered and the population had been evacuated, it got worse. One of the first measures taken was to dump 5,000 metric tons of sand, lead, clay, and neutron-absorbing boron by helicopter. All of the pilots flying over the reactor were poisoned. But the fire that was pushing radioactive particles into the sky was extinguished. From there, an underground passage was taken to the material itself to spray liquid nitrogen to try to cool it down. The fire was finally out, but another problem was discovered. The remaining fuel was smoldering graphite and other materials burning at more than 1,200 degrees Celsius. Underneath the reactor were bubbling pools, which are reservoirs of water used in the emergency cooling pumps and as a pressure suppression system capable of condensing steam in case of a small broken steam pipe. As the graphite and other materials burned through the floor, they mixed with molten concrete from the reactor lining. This combination creates corium, which is a lava-like radioactive material. Its combination with the water would have produced an astronomical amount of steam pressure into an explosion that experts say would have been much worse than the initial explosion itself. 3 men donned diving suits to enter the water tanks and activate the valves that drain the water away, manually preventing an explosion. All 3 men historically lost their lives from radiation poisoning. After all that effort, a greater risk was discovered. Underneath the building itself was the water table, which drained into the Black Sea. If radioactive material reached the table, there would have been a steam explosion and a lethal poisoning of the water supply for southeastern Europe and possibly Western Asia. The material would have also drained through the Mediterranean into the Atlantic Ocean via the Aegean Sea and various straits. The amount of damage this would have caused couldn't even be calculated. Miners were taken from all over the Soviet republics to dig a long tunnel and create a space underneath the building where liquid nitrogen would be pumped in. As the pumping began, it was discovered that 25 metric tons of liquid nitrogen per day would be required to keep the soil frozen at negative 100 degrees Celsius. Since this task was impossible, the authorities filled the space with concrete instead. With the greatest threats neutralized, the worst of the cleanup effort had begun. On the roof of the building was graphite and other radioactive debris. It was needed to be removed from the roof and buried. Initially, remote-controlled machines were sent to move the debris around. This method ultimately failed as the radiation was so high, the circuitry of the machines failed. It was decided that the only solution was to send people up there to shovel it off manually. The men who carried out this task were called liquidators. The military had a nickname for them, biorobots. The radiation was so high on the roof that each man could only stay for 45 seconds. Literally, just over half a minute of work is all a person could do before being killed. 3 men would go take a shovel full of debris and throw it off the roof. Then immediately climb back down so that 3 other men could take their place 10 minutes afterward. All of them were exposed to incredibly high levels of radiation, well beyond what was considered safe. The last effort to contain the remaining nuclear fuel was to be the largest engineering project in history. Experts believed that there was still a threat of another self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction that would cause another explosion. Even something as simple as rain could cause problems, leading to a possible second incident. The plan was to produce a gigantic concrete sarcophagus that would totally encase the reactor. Nothing even remotely close had ever been attempted before. 250,000 workers involved took prefabricated pieces and put them into place. Eventually, by December 1986, the entire reactor was sealed shut. all of the construction workers involved had reached their lifetime limit of radiation. Almost all of the liquidators suffered radiation levels well beyond what was considered safe. Some even experienced levels 100 times what was considered safe. The Chernobyl accident was an inhuman horror that caused an unbelievable amount of suffering. Yet despite the terrible danger, appalling working conditions, 500,000 people stood up and volunteered to prevent a further, more dangerous event. Many people gave their lives in the hopes that the disaster could be contained. Despite the inhumanity of it all, there was a tremendous spirit of self-sacrifice that showed that in the worst situation, people were doing whatever it took to protect humanity. These people are heroes and should be remembered as such.